So welcome, Deef, to the Erasing Shame podcast. My name is DJ Chuang. I co-founded this podcast in 2018, which is 6.5 years ago. And Deef is my younger brother, 7 years younger. And I've known you for 50 plus years.
Yeah.
So thank you for making time to join me on my podcast.
Yes, great to be here.
And we've lived a lot of life together and apart. And you've also had quite the mental health journey and exploration on your own. For new viewers and listeners to this episode, I have lived with mental health struggles for 24 years when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 35. And Deef, you've had some exploration on your own. I'm not sure what the backstory is of how you got interested into mental health, because you don't have an official diagnosis, but you've definitely been well read in recent years with psychology and mental health categories. So what got you interested?
The normal answer is some story and art and all this stuff. I think I've done enough integration. I can sort of list some of the key points. So I think I was born a bit close to the neurodiverse spectrum. So I'm sort of autistic Aspie flavored, but I have some quirks that don't fit into Western autistic methods. So that made me grow up a little bit in the margins as a child. I remember at grade 5 or 6, I have a signed book where it's a bunch of other peers saying, stop cussing and stop doing all this other stuff, because I wasn't catching on with the social shaming and taboos. It's like, this is what we're supposed to do. So I had that, and then I think my mom mentioned when I was in kindergarten, the teachers noticed I was missing kickball really bad, so my spatial orientation, hand-eye coordination was already a bit clumsy at that age.
Oh, I don't remember those incidents.
Well, the parents just sort of say, just study, and they dismiss the information.
Because in some Chinese families, they share all those foibles with everybody in the family. But I didn't hear those.
Well, part of my struggle when I got some adult traumas around age 29 is there's a way of languaging your story in a certain way so other people can understand. One part of autism and neurodiversity is some people use the AAC, the augmented communication tools.
Okay.
So their ability to language might be hyper-literal, where they have amazing language capacity, or some have struggles with language. So I've discovered, after exploring autism and trauma and this other stuff, that my natural inner voice is third person, so I do not have a natural first person narrative that's constantly taking whatever's happening now and putting it into a first person. So I have to do extra work to consciously make a first person narrative.
Wow.
Which
well, you're the first neurodivergent person that's acknowledged some of those symptoms on our podcast. So thank you for being open to sharing that. Because for us neurotypicals, it can be very foreign and hard to understand what life is like for someone that has some or all or many and
some sort of neurodiversity or some margin
category. And there's certainly a diversity of symptoms and things that happen in the neurodiversity realm.
So autism is trying to copy, or autism and neurodiversity is trying to copy the self-advocacy movement of disability. Okay. But one of the challenges I've critiqued on the self-advocacy movement is almost by definition, autistic people and neurodiverse people suck at self-advocacy. Because they're in a different culture. So they're in a different mental culture. They don't process their life with the mainstream, so they would be forced to interpret their life and put it into words that the mainstream can do, and that's a giant ask.
Yeah, I could see that. Okay.
That's why the racist people are the people who are doing diversity. They sometimes just shove it back on the majority culture and say, you guys figure it out. It's not up to us to explain it. But that's also too big of an ask. But we need people that can interpret it. And maybe we're getting there slowly.
Wow. That's a whole another level of challenges in adjusting to what life can be in a quote unquote world with certain norms. Whereas, for those of us with the DSM-5 diagnosed disorders, we're trying to manage symptoms in a way that helps us function in the world
mainstream
as it is for the mainstream. Those without the DSM-5 diagnosis. For a neurodivergent person, they're just in a whole different world trying to
navigate
in a way that's somewhat functional, but it still doesn't make sense.
Well, it's somewhat functional, and they get extra feedback from the neurotypical and the social norms that adds extra demands when they just don't even know what's happening, or they're lost, or they're flooded by overstimulus or whatever, and they're just managing their flood, and then the other people give them more
and they
demands.
have enough stimulus of their own to manage, which kind of shows in movies and things.
Yeah, and the normal mainstream people, they generally have a right to complain and place demands on them because that's the norm. But because they can't advocate that I'm flooded by this noise or I'm flooded by whatever, they end up being the bad guy, that they're breaking a norm and bleeding their flooding on someone else.
Now, is it fair to say that neurodivergent means for many people that it's a oversensitivity to different kinds of stimulus? Or that's only one kind of thing that makes a person neurodivergent?
It's a common sensory, like autism has a sensory processing disorder subcategory that's pretty common. But neurodiversity is a advocacy term. It's not an official DSM term. So some of it can be sensory disorders. So they might have oversensory. I have oversensory in some categories, and I'm just totally oblivious in other categories. So
would you be open to sharing which ones you're most agitated by versus the ones that don't bother you?
Well, I'm very spatially aware. There's a vestibular sensation sensory system that's in the ear that is sort of your inner GPS. So it allows you to have balance. So people have vertigo and they're vestibular. They're just life comes crashing. So I have maybe double feedback of gravity. So I'm always a little off balance, or I have to take a couple more anchors to get data points to get stable. So that'll make me slow. But the upside is that because I have to take extra data points, I can analyze more stuff and I naturally take in more details.
Okay.
But other people, they're navigating by their narrative or by the shared story, so they're getting their orientation there. So I have to catch up, or I have to go try to ask the people with the narrative thing for more data points, and that makes me seem like an asshole.
So I have noticed you're good at details.
Yeah.
Part of that is a compensation so that you can get better oriented.
So I can get better oriented. So I'm a sort of a navigator and a natural wayfinder. But if you're a natural wayfinder and orienter and you're challenging the teacher, the expert, then you're going to challenge their imposter syndrome, or to make them feel a little off. Because I'm not going, oh, we could do this a little better, and they're they're not used to that question.
So in one way, it can be a superpower.
Yes, it's a gift that I try to share, but at the same time, it causes me a lot of social mismatches.
Well, one of the questions, and you've heard several episodes of Erasing Shame, I'm not sure how many, and I've listened to some of your YouTube channel as well. So for the record, your YouTube channel is called Visceral Gravitas. Which is a kind of an esoteric, special name. Do you want to describe the origin of that name? Well, people like origin stories, so.
Just like you came up with a nice title for this off the cuff, I sometimes I play with different wording, and then if it really lands, somehow I play with it fits. So I came up with the pairing certain things, and visceral gravitas ends up matching what the group does and fits. So visceral is like your viscera, so your gut. So that matches my sensory kinesthetic oversensitivity. So if things don't feel, if I can't feel them in the gut, I'm sort of blind.
Mm.
Or if I'll play with different things and I'll have an experience. When I get it in the gut, it's embodied knowledge. So I think that's technically I'm more of an empiricist. So if I can practically apply it, I'm good. But if I have to memorize something that doesn't fit right, then I'm still a little off balance. So that's the visceral part, and then the gravity, I guess that is the density. So if I can fine tune a knowing, or if I can deliver a message that has some gravity, that my approach, or one of my anchors, if I communicate to somebody, or I make some message or whatever, if I pull someone's story, if that message and that story and that learning can have some gravity that will stick maybe 2 weeks later or a year later, and they do a little better, that's my goal. I don't care if they're happy about learning right now. They could like hate the learning right now, but if they get gravity later.
Oh, fascinating. So would you say that's like planting a seed for thought that might...
Yeah, I would be happier to plant a seed or break down a door. That gives them agency or gives them some sort of future gravity.
Fascinating. No. So to anchor our conversation, this podcast is not about interview. I have all the questions and you have all the responses. So it's a conversation, so feel free
to jump in or
jump in with some questions also. We often start our episodes with a question, a prompt, an invitation, which is, what comes to mind when you hear the word shame?
What comes to mind? Very, very open.
Yes, it's an open invitation.
So your framing is erasing shame. My
Yes.
framing is to learn from shame and integrate through shame. So you still erase shame through my method, but because you're learning from shame, you're being transformed, or shame and trauma can be an initiation. So then the shame becomes lightened or becomes transformed into a learning experience, into more social connections, into building more of a social self. Us being Chinese, we have some wiring to care more about the social self instead of an individual self.
Yes. And one of the recent findings in one of the academic journals is the Chinese language has 113 terms related to shame. So we have more words for shame than Eskimos have for snow. So we have a culture
that has many different words,
many layers and nuances to shame. And so much of it is not talked about.
Well, that's the Western explanation. I would say that because there's 100 different words, and there's different ways of communicating shame in the Chinese culture and Asian culture. A lot of the shame might be communicated through rituals, through nonverbal ways. And because when you come over to here, there's no one that's teaching those things. And I've talked, like, Mom is a single child, and I've talked to other Asian Americans who came over here who have, like, we were single children or didn't get taught the rituals from their parents. So they got actively excluded from the peers growing up because they're not doing the rituals. So the rituals are maybe sort of a way that they're embodying and transferring some of the shame messages to get people in harmony. There's no one who just jumps in and explains that. Because, like, a common story for us and other first, second generation is we end up interpreting American English to our parents. So they're lost navigating American culture, so it's hard for them to translate shame dynamics of rituals when there isn't a tribe that's doing the communication. It's not up to one person.
Well, I've also found that Chinese culture is not very explicit.
It's
not explained.
And
so when I was a pastor in a Chinese church, it was very difficult for me. Growing up, even though I grew up in a Chinese family, I didn't understand it. And then when I was thrown into a Chinese church, I didn't know how to navigate.
The navigation. All these little shame cues are collective ritual messages that are sort of nudges given by all kinds of people through looks and all this other stuff and
nonverbals,
nonverbals, all these nonverbal
rituals, expectations that were unspoken.
Yeah.
So say more about how you can learn from shame, because at one point of essence, shame is still that painful feeling, to quote Brene Brown.
Okay.
Who does kind of oversimplify it, at least as a starting point. So a painful feeling is, as we learn in our mental health journey, a feeling is just a feeling, but it's a prompt.
Okay.
It's a light on our dashboard.
Yeah.
To pay attention to something. And as we grow in our emotional maturity and fluency, we can better respond to that out of our agency and out of a healthy place, rather than out of a knee-jerk reaction and judging it per se.
Yeah.
So what is it that we can learn from a painful moment of shame?
Well, I like the framing of it's a painful thing that's a prompt. I would say that in Chinese culture, or maybe because I'm more vestibular and I'm sensing stuff non-verbally already, I'm paying attention to the pain prompts earlier, or I have a wide array of sort of pain messages, prompts that come to me. And that because Western culture navigates things differently, they want the pain to be explicit and within a narrative and to be told. Sometimes they'll dismiss small prompts of shame and pain. And then by the time they acknowledge it consciously, then it's a big crippling shame, pain, whatever, that a lot of the books in Brene Brown talks about. So then you need emergency measures to respond to the shame.
And perhaps the way Western pharmaceutical has addressed pain in a very common way is aspirin is a pain reliever.
Yes, we've grown up with this pain relief mindset.
When we see a pain situation, it's like we've got to find the immediate relief to get rid of pain.
We want a pill, we want McDonald's attitude, and that numbing approach, which Brene also critiques, saying if you numb, then you numb both negative and positive emotions. So you lose the feedback, you lose the positive of the shame, but you also lose your capacity for joy if you're numbing out depression. But if you're in the throes of depressive, suicidal, whatever, and you're crippling, all you want is relief from the pain. So you're not gonna consider the loss of the upside.
Okay, so we're in the month of September, which is suicide prevention month. So let's explore this a little bit more. What is it that we can learn from shame if we sit in it a bit longer instead of just numbing her pain?
Well, I probably stole this from somebody, but I like to simplify depression, or to add to depression as denied expression.
Oh.
So it's an easy memory thing, and I found it fits pretty good for most depressions. So, when you're numb, you don't have energy, you're denied expression, or if you don't have the language, or if you don't have the skills to express your pain or to make it creative, then you just get stuck in that and you start looping, or there's all kinds of other ways you're dealing with this energy, this confusion, this trauma, this shame, that you don't know how to express it, you don't know how to reach out and connect with someone. So the denied expression leads to extended amounts of depression, and then the only way out is self-destruction, or life destruction, or suicide.
Yes. And suicide's a very complicated thing, so I do want to acknowledge there's multiple reasons that people
there are other
go to that despair. But despair and depression is probably the loudest situation that pushes people to that tragedy. And that's been the most painful feeling that I've had to wrestle through in my life. Depression is the loudest for me, and that's why I had to work on myself a lot with self-care and therapy and medication and so on. And for me, denied expression, as I look at my life through that lens, has been not knowing how to express on the one hand.
Lack of language.
And then second, so I wasn't, it's lack of language and not even being able to understand my feeling.
Yeah.
To process
awareness.
That. And then third then would be I didn't have a safe place to explore learning how to express that in my family of origin and many parts of my life.
Relationships, containment, that'd be a technical term, but having relationships, support groups, family, witness attachment theory, having containment, so then the person can contain more of the charge, the expression. And they can even help with language. Yes. But even if you have the wrong language and you have containment, you can start just saying different things until you get the right language.
Well, in plain English, a safe place.
Safe place.
Has been much more accessible, understandable for me. And I've been able to find that through talk therapy with a therapist.
Yeah.
What are some other ways for someone to find containment if they cannot afford talk therapy from your exposure explorations?
Containment. So attachment theory, relationship support, this is a vital element, but sometimes I think we overcomplicate it. I think my path is I tried different support groups and different healing methods, and I'm still searching for connection. And then a lot of people told me, well, if you can't find it, do it yourself. So I did it myself, and I still can't find it. So then I'd go back to those people that said that and said not working, and they'll just give me some other advice. I think if you're out there and you're just searching for if you're just doing something and you do little micro changes of finding a support group here, finding a support group here, and also giving yourself time to digest it. So part of my path was meditation and self-reflective inquiry practices to create more mental containment. I also played around in PTSD forums in the early days and just talking shop and comparing notes. That's a way of finding containment. We were started with suicide notes. So there are like depression meetup communities that do that. There's an avenue there. The challenge I've found with some support groups is there are people that use the support groups as codependent. So there are some potential predators in support groups and other places. So it's a lot of trial and error. There isn't a necessary easy fix. Maybe if people are naturally good at journaling, whether you journal on a blog or on paper or even a video journal, or expressing yourself through music, that is a pretty go-to containment method.
Yeah, I think the way I would say it in response to that is we need multiple modes or modalities or formats of containment. Some that might involve solitude, some that involve arts. And I would say one of them definitely has to involve other people. Because there's something in our neurobiology that requires the mirror neurons of other people to synchronize with our energy and to give that nonverbal feedback.
And right there is the angle that Chinese Confucian culture is about rituals. And I think Bessel van der Kolk, his book, he talks about how his son had trauma, and his son doing theater is working together with other people. And then the theater allows them to get into another character. So you can escape his role, and you can mentalize, have empathy for the character he's playing. And maybe the character he's playing is allowed to emote and be angry and whatever, and he's rewarded for that. Where in the real world, you're supposed to keep your trauma in check, and you're not supposed to lead to your depression, so it's more, doesn't have containment.
And it's common, as I've had many conversations, over 150 episodes here on Erase Shame, that Asian culture is known for suppressing our emotions, which would therefore fit the mnemonic of denied expression.
Yes. The Asian culture, you express it through doing good on your ritual, and you express it behind closed doors in your family. Well, in
sometimes yes, but I'm not so sure.
Well, it's not equal. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It ends up passing down the generation.
Yes. Intergeneration trauma. There it is. So, so what questions does it raise for you as we explore these?
Well,
or is that a challenge as you're diverse friend? Be respectful of that.
I think you've described you have a very dynamic process, and I think I also have a sort of dynamic process, except it's maybe from my inner world is like flailing around and here's a door, and maybe I'll go here and open the door and then try not to stabilize, and if another door comes, and you just go with that and see how it goes. So, a lot of times, Western norms is like, what do you want and what do you desire? And then just that question comes to me, or like, how are you? That also is a question that comes to me usually. I don't know, or terrible. It's not the right answer. But some of your questions, some of our conversation has gone away. Plus the asking about shame, or doing this interview tonight, was trauma.
Yes.
Is framed as PTSD officially in the DSM.
Yes.
And Bessel van der Kolk and some other people are trying to change that or add a nuance to that called DTD, Developmental Trauma Disorder. And I think that adds the angle of developmental issue. So the developmental issue is a life skill OT issue, or I work with a lot of people in my support groups I run in the Visceral Gravitas channel who have CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So they have all these kinds of relational traumas in childhood. So a common thing is they probably didn't get the normal teenage developmental phase where they could explore and navigate mean girls and popularity and whatnot. They end up people-pleasing or playing a fallen self, a one-dimensional social strategy. So then as adults, they're still playing that one-dimensional social strategy. So one thing I try to do in my groups is provide an environment so that they can sort of act out like teenagers, which you just can't do as an adult. And then we have a video and we can review case studies of people acting out, and then we slowly try to make room for incremental developmental growth. Because there's a tendency as adults that we get these giant jumps of growth, or we're taught things with too big of a jump, and it doesn't honor people that might have developmental skill development. They need skills, they need coaching, they need more occupational therapy instead of just repairing their story.
Yeah, we kind of touched on that on our drive home from the airport last night as you would pick me up, and thank you for the ride.
Yeah.
That the American way is to make big, bold steps of progress and milestones in reaching goals, whereas there's a more gentle way of moving into healing through micro steps and micro adjustments. And I think that's what you're alluding to there.
Yeah, and the gentle steps are addressed with somatic trauma therapies, where they're trying to address the nervous system and trying to do breathing techniques, all these. I guess, it is a lot of nonverbal territory with titration, Peter Levine, there's too many people. Polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges. So there's lots of these embodied somatic approaches, which are trying to be physically gentle and restore your body so your nervous system is at least somewhat calm. But that's a given in a Confucian culture. If you're going to try to refine your ritual, or you're trying to get better at Tai Chi or whatever, dance and music, whatever these disciplines of social harmony, they emphasize, the ritual emphasizes being gentle and nudges, so you don't need a prompt of someone telling you need to be gentle. Because you don't want to break out of the ritual, the group action.
Alright, so the Confucian culture, which affects many Asian culture, and certainly most pronounced in East Asian cultures, Chinese, Korean, Japanese.
Yeah.
Has a strong value for family, social harmony, comparatively a wider expression of emotions. That's not to say emotions are not there.
Yeah, the ritual and the collective is more important than the individual.
And when it comes to the category of mental health, it's been challenging to find or develop or to advocate for the ways to help people who have very pronounced struggles with mental health symptoms.
Sure.
And yet the culture, by default, has this gentleness. So there's this huge gap between the potential for the culture to be a place of facilitating healing and yet not being able to address those pronounced symptoms. What do you do with that?
Well, there's the ideal of Confucian culture and there's the practice of Confucian culture.
Okay.
And then Chinese culture and probably most of the Eastern Asian cultures that are shame cultures, they use the threat of social exclusion and banishment to keep everyone in line. So somebody who is incorrigible into the Confucian norms and the faith saving, they just get exiled out. They lose face. They've lost face for the rest of the family. They've lost face in themselves, so they're just living in the margins. Even though the ideals of Confucian culture are addressing the nudging, I want to acknowledge that doesn't mean that that's practiced, and that doesn't mean that it's kind and gentle as a whole culture. One angle is a Confucian culture is Confucian Confucian philosophy is balanced out with Taoism and Buddhism for China. So Taoism emphasizes spontaneous expression. They want to get you back to your unconditioned state, to your unsocially conditioned state, into food and uncarved block. And they want you to be spontaneous in your action that's effortless, so that's Wu Wei. So that's taking action that's from nothing or without any effort. So the Taoist angle, the Taoist flavor of Chinese allows authentic expression, so a lot of like Chinese Chan versus a Japanese Zen, same Buddhism. Japanese Zen, very ritualistic, militaristic, very black and white, all pretty, black, whatever. But I've heard Chinese Chan described as anarchy, because Chinese are more anarchist. So you go to Chinatown and some supermarket, you'll see it's Chinese flavor, where they're just going to take up all the space and then just... So that anarchy allows some level of chaotic expression. That's a more Taoist flavor. And then the Confucian will be a bit more excessive dictatorship hierarchy of people who are just doing the bare minimum to survive.
That helps me interpret of some of those things that I see in Chinatown versus
I had to just figure out these theories of that.
Okay. You're putting words to some things that I've experienced. It's really interesting and enlightening.
Now, you started with the question of how to address Asian culture. There are mental health approaches that are more Confucian friendly. So,
yes, please introduce them.
So Japanese, there's a Japanese model that's focused more on the art of taking action. So one benefit of Confucian culture and Taoist religion, or maybe it's philosophy, is that it's those models are losing the self, and those models are you lose yourself into flow. So a lot of the flow hacking that the Westerners have done is just trying to take Taoism and convert it to the Westerners. One of the discoveries they found with flow is it is a self-forgetting process. You're in a zone where you forget about yourself. Okay. So if you're in a Taoist meditation, or you're in a collective ritual of Confucianism, or you're in some sort of group activity that has the right balance of challenge and skill, you forget about yourself. And then you can have that practice as a way to get away from your inner critic and your stresses. And you have community if you're doing it with other peers who have the same interest. So some of these more Confucian-friendly therapist approaches are more about the art of taking action and losing yourself in the action. And then also, by losing yourself in a discipline that's micro nudges, you're doing a ritual that's teaching your body to do micro nudges and pay attention to subtle shifts. And it's going to be hard for you not to do that psychologically.
It sounds a little bit like a gentler CBT when you're focused on action rather than focused on...
Yeah, CBT does have that as an approach, but a lot of people focus too much on the cognitive part. But CBT has always been an exposure-based therapy.
I see.
But a lot of people just shortcut it by trying to work on the cognitive part. But if you have unprocessed trauma and lagging life skills, you don't have enough exposure to match the education. So a catchphrase I learned at some autism workshop about anxiety was anxiety has two elements that need to be in balance. Okay. So one element is experience. So that's exposure experience. And the other element is education. So that's why if we have a lot of anxiety, we get education. It eases anxiety. But if we have too much education, that creates imposter syndrome or that creates paralysis because we haven't taken that education and built the skill. So the right balance of education and exposure is also a sweet spot for anxiety, but is also a sweet spot for flow. So if you have the right amount of challenge that is a little bit beyond your skill, now you have your own personal carrot all right, to potentially give you a flow state.
Okay. So now that I'm thinking a little more and drawing from Eastern thought, there's some of the concepts like mindfulness and self-compassion and accepting the reality of suffering as part of life rather than something to be running away from. So all of those can be part of our healing path, for lack of a better phrase.
This is also a philosophical difference from Asian to Western, from Eastern to Western cultures, that Chinese culture is fatalist, but it's just fate first. It's not fatalist that everyone's just reckless.
or destined for the worst.
Yeah, it just accepts that destiny could be outside of our control. We start there. Western culture is a bit, almost the definition of science and technology is how can we conquer nature? We're going to conquer the material world. So that's sort of this free will, conquer nature mindset. Okay. So a lot of that starts with negation. How do I break things apart? How do I negate what's not true? And then through multiple negations, I get to the truth. Asian culture is, we're going to die and fate is this, and we might repeat ourselves in karma forever. There's all these different flavors of a fatalist approach, and that makes it sort of the default cultural norm to surrender. So Asian culture doesn't need a bunch of mindfulness surrender practices because we start at fatalism. I did research on Chinese movies, and almost all the Chinese movies, it's depression and fate wins at the end. And maybe if there's a hero, it might be the collective wins, but there isn't this hero narrative that's pretty common in Hollywood movies.
There's no conquering the world, but you're just part of the way the world is,
and working together as a collective is how you conquer the challenges. Those are the underlying narrative stories in Chinese movies.
And then to circle back a bit of what you started to introduce about Asian, Chinese, and Confucian culture, and where the gentleness aspects do show up, but not evenly across every realm of life. The gentleness can be most obviously seen through practices like Tai Chi and meditation and the way we moderate our expression in our social settings, that we don't fight out loud, but we try to find a mediator and things like that. But in certain other uncomfortable situations, we just avoid and suppress. in this realm.
Don't mess up the social harmony. There's a lot of that restriction, which can be very oppressive. Okay. Or competitive. Some people might try to gain it.
Now, as we turn the corner, and this season we've been talking about Christian Asian mental health, and we want to be open and realistic that not everybody is Christian in this world. So, for me as a Christian, and for you as, I don't know where your spiritual identity lies now, but you've been very open in exploring your spirituality. How does that fit into your life and your world today?
The spiritual element, or just
however you conceive of it? Yes.
Well, I'm still trying to discover where I fit.
Okay.
So, I think I'm more Taoist, but then when all the Taoist teachers are talking about special powers and immortality and all this stuff that I can't do, so apparently I don't fit into that realm. I'm also somewhat Confucian, but I don't fit there, and Confucianism, a church or a philosophy that people talk about.
Because in Eastern thought, religion is not religion the way the Western world thinks of it. In Eastern thought, it's more way of life, it's more philosophy, it's more practice. It's a way of life. And so the whole category in the language is just does not compute. And
but back to Christianity. So Christianity has a story of rebirth. And I like the story of rebirth as also a pointer for initiation and taking traumas and trauma. If trauma could be turned into initiation, it's about what doesn't die after your trauma. And then one of the tricky things about mental health is there is an incentive to go back and reject the trauma experience. So then you're trying to hold on to what's supposed to die.
Oh, wow.
You're trying to hold on to your old skin.
That is a fascinating reframe to take that traumatic moment, which typically happens during an event or during a duration of repeated events that is very painful and causes a person to be overwhelmed and not functioning the way they used to. And it can take a very long process, arduous effort to recover from that post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
But the hope is there's a point of recovery, and I think what you just pointed out, there's a point of decision to recognize that not all is lost.
There's something that didn't die. And that something could be a doorway, which could be a metaphorical angle of the Christian rebirth and the getting reborn through Christ or baptism. This also matches a lot of mythological narratives, grand narratives about initiations in trauma. So if it's like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey.
Yes. It's the inciting incident.
And then I've had people in my group and also my traumas. So I had 3 traumas at age 29 that started the doorway of opening up my blind spot that I wasn't seeing the whole social landscape. So the trauma opened up that awareness in me. And then, so I have accepted that the trauma happened, so I'm not trying to fight to get back before the trauma. I don't know if I'm happy about the trauma.
No.
I'm still not happy about how that disrupted my life, but I'm making the best of it. And if I were to reject the trauma, I wouldn't know what my life would be like now. So I'm at peace with going through that door and trying to convert myself after the trauma.
Yeah, so trauma, using some visual metaphor, trauma can be a door to a different life. You can call it a new normal. I'm not sure that's the best language for it, but definitely a door and a path,
a rebirth,
a gateway to something different, something new. Something meaningful. We also touched on in our conversation last night about how we, as humans, we need to find meaning through suffering. And definitely trauma is suffering. So we can't call it that.
Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, that was his argument.
Yes.
And love. So meaning and love.
Yes. And then, what's the other thing I was going to say? If it comes back.
It'll come back when it comes back.
Yeah.
So the rebirth is something that I've used as an idea, and it's worked for me. And then even this last Saturday's meeting, somebody was really outraged about being deceived and duped, and he wanted to create a rule that I want to never experience that trauma again. And then I remembered 2 years back where he described the story that he was growing up, and his husband's family was making jokes and calling him a different name for 15 years. And it's because it's a dig at the new wife. And he ended up being the scapegoat of that. And then, so I was like, this pain is linked to this pain back then. Is there any chance that this pain of being deceived helped your business? Is there any chance that you have better radar for spotting deception? And then he said, oh yeah, he saw the link there quick. And I said, do you want to reject this gift?
Wow. And that's another metaphor to see some kind of
to look value. For the gift and the curse, to look for the something in the poison. There's metaphors. There's a lot of metaphors in mythology where this path has been repeated through different cultures, the path of initiation.
Wow. Well, I hope that some of that is helpful.
And that's also elderhood. So one thing missing, maybe that's why we're looking for therapists and experts, is we have maybe this initiatory pull to look for an elder to sort of show the grand map, to sort of like ask the right questions, is like, where's the missing message? What's stuck why are you looping in this trauma? We need people, so we are looking for community. But since we don't have formal initiation, we don't have, organized elderhood of whatever, and we're all isolated in these different islands. We don't live in a tribe or society, where we have sub leaders that can sort of keep an eye on everybody, to fill in the gaps. We're all sort of looking for elders, and we're looking to process the initiation. That's just modernization has taken them that way.
Yeah, because there's a lot of things in life that cannot be learned in books. It can only be learned through real life experience.
Relationships, experiences, role modeling, ritualing, mentorship, a gentle peer, a gentle substitute father figure, a path of apprenticeship.
Yes, fantastic. While we're late into the night, I can tell my energy is waning.
Okay.
But I've really enjoyed having a moment to connect with you. And I want to express to you as my brother and before our viewing audience how much admiration I have for you over the years, especially in recent years, and how much you've grown personally, and how much you've sacrificed and cared for our dad, and our yourself and others, because you've been active through hospice, which is a very gracious act. And so I'm delighted to see that you've become a better version of yourself, to use one of the vernaculars.
Yes, and then I think this will be the last time we did an interview was 13 years ago, 2011.
Yes,
maybe I can revisit that, or people can revisit that to see how young both of us look.
Yeah, and that's an episode we'll add in the show notes. It was a debrief of the time when our dad just passed away. We wanted to say, well, what would it like to be caregiving for a Chinese father who was had a 2.5 year decline, bed rest, decline, dying, the process of dying and grieving.
And that is also a traditional initiation period to switch roles. And in some Confucian cultures, there's a ritual after the death where people intentionally in the family play different roles to sort of stir things up so that a new role setup can happen. I tried to get Mom to play the head of the family role, and she's been rejecting that. So we're a family system without one clear head even after 13 years.
Yes.
Or a decision method.
And sometimes families can navigate without that.
Yeah, we were still navigating, surviving, but the old system of navigation was there. And
we had a very clearly defined authority.
Maybe it was over-defined by dads, and now we don't have a transition protocol.
And
but that's life,
sense.
and that's so it's life to keep adapting, and that's something that Chinese culture and flow and change and these sort of get better at adapting is missing in a lot of therapeutic approaches.
Well, I think by default, what our family has done is try to build consensus, which is kind of a Chinese way to do things. As I've had some exposure to other Chinese families and church culture where you try to, there's no clear authority or decision-making structure, then you try to build some kind of consensus from the people you have and try to make as many people happy as you can. And then you'll kick the ball down the field as long as you can so that you can get
now this ability to build consensus. Maybe that is a muscle that we can default to, that we've defaulted to in other Asian cultures. Mm-hmm. But I've heard stories of Western families, and they don't have that. It's not very common that there's this build consensus attitude. Mm-hmm. So then they do all the boundaries and estrangement also, because social harmony is not part of the culture.
No, it's my way or the highway is the default.
Yeah.
You can always jump in the car and go.
Yeah. So then there's always this thread of cutoff and boundaries and exciting drama.
So in a closing minute, you want to say a little bit more about visceral gravitas?
It's a YouTube channel that is an offshoot of a Zoom group that was an offshoot of an in-person support group that originally was a mental health support group for narcissistic relationship abuse. And then I added a little bit more path of mastery, and then was sort of just a sparring ground to try this to help build this muscle of dealing with conflict that normally is developed in the teenage years, but also the pivotal, terrible 2 years where you learn how to say no and you have a tantrum and you see the world doesn't die. So this very exposure-based approach is I'm trying to fill in a gap for some stupid reason, because it's traumatizing most people on the surface, but we have a different goal.
Well, it's uncomfortable for people in the Eastern and the Western world. So I'm really surprised and amazed that you would want to step into that discomfort.
Well, maybe that's part of my vestibular where to navigate, I need that obvious feedback. And then I can interpret it, and maybe it doesn't seem like anybody else is able to interpret it so fine. So now I found a niche, but it's a niche that gets constant shutdown because I'm threatening the status quo, which fits my Enneagram type. So it's a sort of love-hate relationship, and it's a channel that's there that I have times where I want to shut it down, and then some new thing comes in, so it keeps going. So it's an experiment, so feel free to join in. And I've also been pulled to become an interpreter for neurodiverse people, because somehow I can see a lot of stuff, but I keep trying to avoid that. I only do that to it on the side.
Well, thank you again. Good to chat with you. And thank you for watching and listening to this episode of the Erasing Shame podcast.
Bye-bye. Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Get this episode's show notes at our website, erasingshame.com. Subscribe to the Erasing Shame podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast app. And please add a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our message of hope and healing.